You're listening to 4315, a podcast about empowering workers and exposing the union-busting industry. Presented by Labor Lab. For more information and resources about the right to unionize and how to protect it, visit laborlab.us.
Hello and welcome to 4315. My name is Megan Sullivan.
My name is John Reynolds.
And while the goal of this podcast will be to highlight working class struggles, unionization, and labor issues, this first episode is going to be kind of special. Now, John and I, we experienced a brutal anti-union campaign at a vegan plant meat company called No Evil Foods. This first episode is really just going to be an overview of what that was like, where we went wrong, and what you can do to avoid the experiences that we had.
I think we should take it back to the beginning when the union drive first started. This was the summer of 2019, several months before you or I even worked there. Workers at the time wanted better pay and benefits, and from our understanding, this was when the very first anti-union meeting happened. Both morning shift and night shift were in that very first meeting, and it was just sort of an overview of the reasons why No Evil didn't want a union. But they didn't really have to go full union buster at the time because either by design or coincidence, they changed the schedule from a 4-day work week to a 5-day work week, which caused a whole lot of people to quit. That slowed down the union effort, but it did not kill it. Thankfully, one worker at the time picked up the torch and kept the drive going, which is where Megan and I came in. I took the job in the fall of 2019, and Megan started shortly after I did. But we had no idea we were taking the jobs of people who quit because of the schedule change. Conversely, No Evil Foods had no idea they were hiring people who would help keep the union drive going. But I think what bothers me, even to this day, is that I took the job at No Evil Foods because I wanted a career with them. I've been working my whole life and really thought that I'd have a stable, long-term opportunity with a company that not only aligned with me as a vegan, but as someone who identified with their lefty marketing. Unfortunately, that marketing was just marketing, as we learned in months to come.
Yeah, No Evil Foods did and still does do a decent job marketing people's values right back to them. Not that I want to spend the entire episode focusing on their ridiculous marketing, but for some context, at the time, these people had products named after the Zapatistas. They currently have a product named Comrade Cluck, lots of socialist imagery on their packaging, lots of talk about saving the planet. So it's funny that they thought they weren't going to attract employees that actually wanted to do that. But yeah, so when I was hired there, I was genuinely happy with the job. I think you were too. I had never worked in food manufacturing before, and I was so excited to work for a company that espoused such a relatable set of values. That isn't to say there weren't problems, though.
Problems like, what, having corrosive chemicals around while we were working with gloves that had holes in them and wearing ski goggles? Those kinds of issues? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, those kinds of issues, like the ones where there was this big freezer that we had to push the product into, and these rickety old shelves that had, like, where we kept all of the food. At any moment, that food could come tumbling down on you, and there was just no precaution when it came to things like that, and that was one of my major concerns with it. So, like, while we both loved the job, there were definitely things that needed attention there. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. I mean, the mixer that we were using at the time was leaking some kind of a black substance into the product, and we were just told, oh, yeah,
it's food grade.
It's food grade, yeah, so don't worry about it.
Food grade goo, it's fine, guys.
You know, stuff like that. Yeah, we definitely needed, we needed a union in there, and I mean, there were things that I liked about the job too, but everything that I liked about the job, I wanted to solidify with a union contract, and the things that I didn't like, I wanted to change with a union,
But I think out of all of that, the biggest concern that I and a lot of us had, especially those of us who were really interested in the unionization effort, was, you know, this is a company that was technically a startup. They relied on investor money to operate their company. But the whole concept was to scale up the company and eventually, you know, as they phrased it, take over the planet. Like, they wanted to scale up and be a major manufacturer, you know, be sold everywhere, abroad, you know, all 50 states, that kind of thing. And when you have a company that's trying to do that, they're going through constant changes, constant rule changes, constant procedure changes. And as a worker, as you're working while they're doing that, you need protection, not only from them, you know, selling off the company or, you know, scaling up and moving to different facilities and leaving everybody in the cold. You know, there were so many concerns and so many questions about what was going to happen. And, you know, some of us just wanted that extra layer of protection.
So there are a lot of tactics that companies will use to try to bust up union organizing efforts. And one of those tactics is something called employee roundtables, which had a less sinister name as they were actually happening. Workers at the time were calling them grievance sessions.
Some of them were calling them bitch sessions.
And in these meetings, we were basically broken up into rotating groups with different managers and allowed to discuss concerns relating to the workplace. It was kind of like an open forum for us to give feedback, and we really all thought that this was a genuine attempt by management to hear feedback. But as I later learned, this was a tactic that had been perfected decades ago by union busters like Marty Levitt, who wrote a book back in the 90s called Confessions of a Union Buster. In that book, he talks about employee roundtables as, quote, management's tap into the worker grapevine and its repressive thumb on the informal worker power structure. The regular group meetings provided management with a system for planning information as well as for identifying and controlling the leaders among the employees. He writes that by continually changing the makeup of the employee committee, management could keep abreast of complaints and rumors circulating in the various departments without creating a bond among the participants or inadvertently developing leaders.
Yeah, it's really insidious. At the time, it never actually occurred to me how problematic it was that we weren't able to address grievances as one cohesive group. I mean, looking back at it now, it's so obvious to me that the intention was far less about our opinions as it was identifying who was willing to speak up about the problems we had as workers and doing it in such a way that prevented us from discussing it as one collective group. But, I mean, you and I both know that the mask really came off when the captive audience meeting started, though.
So for those of you who might not know, captive audience meetings are typically mandatory paid meetings where workers are forced to sit through a barrage of anti-union propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, and it's all with the intended purpose of sowing division among workers and creating confusion and distrust about what unions are and what they do.
Yeah, the first captive audience meeting was relatively informal and included both morning and night shift. The CEO at the time, Mike Wolyansky, gave an overview of why they didn't want us to unionize with the UFCW, which is the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, specifically UFCW Local 1208. His stated reasons included that the UFCW and Local 1208 represented a portion of workers employed by meat manufacturers. There was this overall talking point that went on into other meetings that said, you know, you may end up with more than what you make now, you may end up with less, or it could stay the same. He and the other owners, Sadra Shadell, could lose everything if the company goes under, and heavily implied that this was inevitable if we unionized, that it would create this adversarial relationship between employees and management. He told us to Google UFCW sexual harassment and UFCW slaughterhouses. He told us that he thought our voices were already powerful enough and that we didn't need a third party, even though, like, I think that one annoys me the most because it's like a union is not actually a third party. A union is you and your coworkers advocating for your best interest.
Yeah, this was the same meeting where they said that union cards are legal documents. I mean, really throughout all of these meetings, they emphasized the word legal and made it sound like they were, there were all these legal obligations that would, like, come with unionizing, which was one of the major talking points as these meetings continued.
Yeah, there were 7 of these meetings total, and after the initial meeting that we just talked about, they became much more formal and aggressive, and management determined that these meetings were so important that they had to stop production in the middle of the shift to have them. Some of these meetings lasted up to 2 hours and became this divisive back and forth with organizers and management.
Which is honestly where I think we made a mistake as organizers, because that back and forth is exactly what they wanted. They wanted to paint us as aggressive. They wanted to paint us as hostile. And there was even an email sent out by the CEO which painted union organizers kind of like aggressive salespeople who were going to show up at your house. And I think in addition to that, they also made a point of painting the union itself as a business. I remember the VP of Manufacturing, Mark McPeak, who is also a Teamster, a former Teamster. He said in one of the 2 meetings he held that, I got the quote right here, he said, "Just like no evil, the union is a business. That's the beginning and the end of it. It's a business. You can call it this, you can call it that. It's a business, period. End of sentence. They're in the business of negotiating labor contracts. It is a business."
Of course, Mark also had to make the inevitable joke about how when he was in the Teamsters, it was probably run by this dead guy named Jimmy Hoffa. Fucking evoking Jimmy Hoffa. Incredible.
I really feel like Mark's meetings kind of set the tone for the meetings that came after. Mm-hmm. After the first one with Mike, they split up the day shift and the night shift, and they held the meetings separately, which honestly was kind of good for us being on the night shift, because the morning shift would tip us off as to what was being said, and it gave us time to come up with ways to start kind of sifting through and diffusing all that propaganda that we would expect on the night shift.
Well, which kind of reminds me of another mistake we made worth mentioning, which is that we started the inoculation too late. Inoculation is so important, and I think we realized a little too late into these captive audience meetings what was happening and how we could stop it.
Yeah, I don't think any of us were really expecting to be subjected to a full-on propaganda campaign, but that's exactly what it was. Even before the meetings, I remember coming into work one day, opening up the door to the production facility and seeing all these papers lining the doors and the windows, and they were like these World War II style propaganda posters that said, like, in big letters, "Is this the union you want to join?" And there was like this news article underneath about an embezzlement scandal in the UFCW. And of course, as you pointed out in the meetings,
I remember this.
This was a snippet of an article that failed to mention any of the aftermath, and like how the UFCW sniffed out its own corruption, held in all the people that were responsible, held them all accountable.
Well, they didn't want us to see that part. They weren't interested in telling us the whole story, just the part that they wanted us to see that fit their narrative.
No, of course they didn't, and I think that's why they stopped taking questions after the first few meetings, because the first few meetings started with us having the ability to ask questions, but after a while I think they kind of got tired of having people calling them out, so they started holding off all the questions till the end. Conveniently, this made it seem like we were the ones holding the meetings up, but I think in an overall sense, even though they effectively made us look aggressive in these meetings, they really also weren't like looking that great in the beginning, especially in the meetings with Mark, where he was getting openly hostile with people, telling them to go look it up if it makes yourself happy, getting defensive. Somebody even asked him at one point in one of his meetings why he was being so hostile. It was such a bad look for management. And I'm sure No Evil's union-busting lawyers from Constangy weren't very happy about that.
Mark really did make an ass out of himself. It's so amazing to me that they allowed him to conduct not one, but 2 of these meetings before realizing that.
Honestly, I feel like the theme of his meetings could be encapsulated like the union constitution is this maze. It's impossible to understand. And as he said in his meetings, it's deliberately designed to be like that. And if you don't understand it, the union can sue you, and you won't get a lawyer, and you'll end up being sued by the union without a lawyer, all while paying dues.
Well, Mark's meeting was when one of the production managers also interjected and asked a question about a scenario in which an employee was making others feel uncomfortable or unsafe. Of course, this scenario was not imagined. It was something that had happened only weeks prior, and the woman who was involved was in the room when this question was asked. It was the start of a talking point designed to play on fears of sexual harassment. A talking point later expanded on in greater detail in Sadra Shadell's speech, aka the new No Evil Foods CEO, as of April 2022, this year. When I pointed out to this woman that sexual harassment is a societal problem that isn't only subject to unions or even workplaces in general, she insisted to the entire night staff I was coming from an apologist point of view and had the audacity to ask me if Harvey Weinstein was absolved of his crimes because he was held accountable. I will never get over that.
That was absolutely appalling. Honestly, one of the things I'll never get over is how they said we shouldn't unionize with the UFCW. Because the UFCW Local 1208 also represents meatpacking workers at Smithfield, as if meatpacking workers don't deserve basic safety and a living wage. I mean, don't get me wrong, I hope Smithfield goes out of business tomorrow, but until that happens, I think their workers deserve to live with dignity.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that most people working in slaughterhouses and meat manufacturing are statistically working there because they don't have any other options.
I'll also never get over Becky, the plant manager at the time, comparing union dues to what she called a shitty gym membership and saying how she's so incredibly bothered by people who work for unions making these huge salaries, which she said is entirely funded by union dues. And it's like, your salary is funded by our labor. One of the other meetings where we were in where they talked about collective bargaining, and this was an incredibly memorable moment for me because I asked the guy who was doing the meeting, who was also the payroll guy, I asked him to name one benefit, because he's doing this meeting and he's talking about collective bargaining, and he's listing off all of these negatives and all of these uncertainties, and I'm like, I raised my hand and I'm like, can you just name like one? Just give me one positive of collective bargaining, and he just flat out refused to do it. And I'm like, really? You're supposed to be giving us facts so we can make an informed decision before we vote, but you can only list negatives about collective bargaining? And this was the same guy who said that everything was up for negotiation in collective bargaining, including things like where the surveillance cameras are and drug and alcohol policies, and even whether we would be allowed to get a free vegan turkey on Thanksgiving. It was just absolutely ridiculous.
Well, and so after 7 of these meetings, each more hostile than the last one, we eventually reach February 13th of 2020, Election Day. The results were in.
43-15.
43-15.
An absolutely devastating set of numbers, but I think those numbers are still important for us to name the podcast after them, because those numbers encapsulate the effectiveness of union busting and the lessons we can take away from everything that happened. And what happened isn't unique to No Evil Foods. We've seen it most recently at Starbucks and Amazon, and I'm sure we'll keep seeing it until these tactics are exposed and workers are effectively inoculated against all this nonsense. And I also think the vote coming back 43-15, that number is also kind of a testament to the resilience we had to keep organizing. It was an absolutely crushing defeat, but even after we lost, we showed No Evil Foods that we could, and we would, continue to organize because we were the union.
Yeah, the story definitely doesn't end with the election results. Just about a month later, as soon as things started to feel like they were returning to business as usual at No Evil Foods, COVID-19 happened and turned everything on its head.
Yeah, we were working with immunocompromised people. We were working in a tiny production facility with these super narrow corridors and changing rooms. And we were working around machines that it was impossible to consistently social distance, and people were getting scared. And that culminated in management rolling out a policy that basically opened up the doors for us to organize around. They gave us 24 hours. Some people got way less than that to decide whether to keep working with the company and receive a temporary pay bump if we maintain 90 days of perfect attendance. We could quit with the option to reapply at a later date, or we could quit, receive 3 weeks of severance, sign an NDA, which barred us from talking to the media, and sign away our right to sue the company for any potential violations of the National Labor Relations Act, the ADA, the Civil Rights Act. So they lost a good chunk of the workforce in a short amount of time, kind of like they did the previous summer with the schedule change. And a lot of those people they lost were organizers, but thankfully not all of them.
Yeah, those of us that were left decided that the options we were presented by the company were completely unacceptable. So what we ended up doing was putting together a petition demanding immediate hazard pay without any strings attached. And I gotta say, it was really beautiful watching us go from 43 to 15 to having all but 4 production workers in the facility sign this petition. It was amazing.
It really was amazing. And at this point, there were also articles dropping about what was happening at No Evil. And one of the first articles was by Andrew Miller, who wrote an article for the Industrial Worker, and basically broke the story about the union busting that was going on at No Evil Foods.
Oh my God, Andrew. Okay, if you don't follow Andrew Miller, please go follow his work. Just saying.
So one of the tactics the IWW, which is the Industrial Workers of the World, suggested was a march on the boss, which is exactly what we ended up planning. We had a majority of signatures on this petition, and we planned to go to the CEO's office, and we were going to go there with 4 to 5 workers and basically turn the petition in. And the day before we planned to do this, about 30 minutes before the end of my shift that night, I was pulled off the production floor by the head of human resources, and he starts this conversation by repeatedly asking me, "How are you doing? You look stressed. Are you okay? Are you sure you're okay? You look like something's bothering you." And he was fishing. He wanted me to tell him about the petition. He knew about it. And so I told him we had a majority of signatures on the petition. We were going to turn it in, and we were going to do something about the working conditions there because management didn't want to. And he told me that I had been identified as one of 4 people behind the petition and asked if it was related to the union drive. Mm. Yeah, and this conversation would end up costing No Evil Foods thousands of dollars, as I later learned, because it was a very clear violation of the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA. And so the next day, as we're walking into the warehouse with this petition on our hands, management calls an emergency meeting, and they bring both shifts together, and they announce immediate hazard pay without any strings attached. And of course, they never mentioned the petition. They never credited us. They just credited their decision to the activity of other businesses in the area. And then they spent the month of April 2020 just targeting and firing all the remaining organizers.
So one of those organizers, her name is Courtney, she's wonderful, was sent home for wearing pants that were allegedly too short. Now, these pants were pants she had worn dozens of times before, and were much longer than a lot of the pants I even wore and never got in trouble for. But now all of a sudden they were unacceptable, and she was subsequently fired. I was actually targeted for allegedly being 1 minute late on April 17th and 2 minutes late on April 28th. And when I was approached by management about this, she wanted me to sign a paper stating that my tardiness was unacceptable and that I could face termination if it happened again. We're talking about 1 and 2 minutes. It still blows my mind. So I told her that I wasn't willing to sign anything unless the paper specifically stated how late I was and on what days. And she told me that she didn't have the authority to change what was on the paper, but that I was welcome to go chat with HR about it.
Yeah, and that kind of also raises a very important point, and that's documenting everything is just so important. Like asking HR for that was top-notch and good move. I mean, especially when it comes to reprimands, get it in writing, get it on audio, record, document every single thing.
Yeah, definitely. That is so important. And so when I go to HR with my phone in hand, recording the entire interaction just for my own peace of mind, because I knew this allegation was nonsense, I brought up my concerns about the situation, and I expressed to him what it would take in order for me to sign the paper. And he told me he would look into it and get back to me. But instead...
Yeah.
Instead,
the very next day at the production door, I'm fired for performance issues and allegedly violating social distancing guidelines.
I always thought he might have been projecting a little about the performance issues.
And they fired me on May Day, I should add. Fucking May Day. Absolute irony. And so, I mean, in the spirit of the holiday, on the same day, I filed a charge with the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board.
Can I just point out how absolutely disgusting and offensive it is to fire somebody, strip them of their health care, on top of losing their job in the middle of what was a raging pandemic over something that the NLRB would later determine was a violation of the NLRA?
Yeah, well, technically they never admitted fault, or at least that's the argument they made after the NLRB found merit. But it's hard for me to believe that a company that's not guilty of violating the law would shell out over $40,000 between me and Courtney if they didn't do anything wrong, unless they're just handing out money for the fun of it. But I think we should just back up a minute, because the NLRB found merit in the fall of 2020. But that summer, No Evil was getting absolutely roasted by their followers on all of the big social media outlets for the union busting. And they responded to that by deleting comments, by blocking people, and even by exploiting copyright laws to get recorded clips from their anti-union meetings pulled. Andrew Miller's entire website was taken down. Vice News shared a video of the first anti-union meeting, and that video was pulled. And 2 podcasts that we were on at the time, which shared audio from these meetings, the podcasts were Dixieland of the Proletariat and Working People Podcast. They both had episodes taken down for copyright infringement, all because No Evil was claiming to have the rights to audio that was recorded on my phone. This wasn't their material. It's still not their material. It's mine. And when the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a civil liberties group, found out about what was going on, they sent a letter to No Evil telling them to basically knock it off or they'd be risking legal action.
Another thing I want to point out that also happened over that summer is an article that appeared in Veg News. And if you're not familiar with Veg News, it's one of the largest publications in the vegan world. And here's No Evil Foods making absolutely 100% false claims about union organizers. They claim that we were threatening their children, extorting them, lying about them, taking, I quote, taking big union money. You know, I'm still waiting 2.5 years later for them to present any kind of evidence or, just even present anything that led them to believe any of these things were true. It's absolutely crazy to me. It still bothers me to this day. Yeah. Article is still out there.
So it's the fall of 2020. The NLRB found merit that No Evil violated the law. And, of course, instead of facing what I think would have been absolute humiliation in court, they decide to settle. And that settlement paid off my car, which, thanks, Mike. And in early 2021, just a couple months later, I start getting messages from people who still work at No Evil saying that the company is laying people off, people are being fired. The people who are talking to me are speculating that the company is about to go under. Some are suspecting that they're moving towards automation, or they're about to sell the company. But in June, we figure out what's actually going to happen. And so No Evil calls an emergency meeting, and with no warning, fires the entire production team. These people received no severance, none of their accrued paid time off. The only thing they got was a letter of recommendation and a flyer for a job fair. And this is just a year and a few months after the union election, and now all of these people who stood by No Evil through the pandemic, through the union drive, they're suddenly without a job and they're without health care. And No Evil was outsourcing, they ended up outsourcing the manufacturing to a third-party co-packer out in Danville, Illinois.
Oh yeah, coincidentally, a co-packer that also makes actual beef jerky products.
Yeah. They didn't want to partner with the UFCW Local 1208 because they represent workers at a meatpacking plant. But they'll fire their whole production team with no warning and no severance and outsource their jobs to a co-packer who is totally in bed with the meat industry if it means satisfying their investors.
So John and I spent last summer fundraising for the workers that were laid off, and we actually managed to raise, with the help of, different podcasters and media outlets. We raised over $3,000 for those workers that requested funding, all while No Evil Foods ignored our fundraising efforts.
Yeah, and spent the summer complaining about how they're only making $50,000 salaries. They cut their salaries back to $50,000.
Really what happened demonstrates why it's so important to have a union. Even if the union had been voted in, it doesn't necessarily mean that this massive layoff wouldn't have happened, but they may have had, some added protection. They would have been able to argue for severance or an extension of healthcare or, anything. And it's just so unfortunate that we will never know.
The whole story at No Evil, from start to finish, is just such a fantastic case study of union busting and the importance of unionization. Workers were told that they didn't need a union. They were told that management and the owners were looking out for them. And this isn't unique to No Evil Foods. This is what all companies do. They tell their workers their family, they keep them loyal, they exploit their labor, and then they dispose of them when they're no longer necessary. And I think the lessons from our experiences at No Evil are what we want to take with us moving forward with this podcast. We want to platform workers in similar struggles, help them avoid the mistakes we made, expose union-busting tactics, and really just uplift the working class however possible.
I think, number one, that's beautiful. I completely agree. And I think on that note, that's going to conclude the first episode of 4315. We thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to bringing you more content. As always, we want to thank Labor Lab for giving us this amazing opportunity to discuss these important issues. And I'd also like, again, to ask the owners of No Evil Foods, Mike Woliansky and Sabre Shadell, to address the lies they told about organizers and Veg News. Until next time, I'm Megan Sullivan.
And I'm John Reynolds.
Love and solidarity forever.
You're listening to 4315, a podcast about empowering workers and exposing the union-busting industry. Presented by Labor Lab. For more information and resources about the right to unionize and how to protect it, visit laborlab.us.